This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and it's Saturday, and that means it's time for another edition of Nizzanotes, this weekly vlog series that I do when I talk about limited magic. We're still talking about Crimson Vow Limited, and in this video I want to give you my rankings, my tiers for the archetypes in Crimson Vow Limited. Now, I do want to say up front that this isn't a video where I'm telling you to avoid specific color pairs. I'm just telling you what my rankings are for the color pairs based on how easy it is for these decks to come together, how consistent and how powerful they are. But the good news is that this isn't a format where there's a lot of imbalance between the colors and the archetypes. All of them are completely viable archetypes. We haven't seen that as much the last few sets. You know, we've had sets where one deck was way better than the others or way worse than the others, or sometimes both. That's not really the case here. There are tiers. There is a deck that I think is the worst. There's a deck that I think is the best. But the gap between the best and the worst deck on this list isn't nearly as wide as you might think. Again, all of these archetypes are completely viable and so forth. So I'm going to talk about each of these color pairs, what they're trying to do synergy-wise, and then also talk about a key common. If you want to hear me go even deeper on these archetypes, at least before the set was released, I do have an archetype guide where I cover them in a lot more detail, talking about a whole bunch of cards. But this now is obviously me having played with the set and having the ability to rank them, something I couldn't do when I did my archetype guide. Alright, so I have things divided into 3 tiers. In Tier 1, I have 3 decks, and at the very top of Tier 1, I have red-black. This is an aggressive deck, one that really makes use of blood tokens. Blood has turned out to be an overperformer in this set overall. Everything that makes blood is a little better than I expected it to be. There's lots of things you can do with it. Just being able to rummage with blood in the first place is a really big deal. It's flexible. You can have it be your flood insurance in the late game where you start throwing away lands you don't need. You can use it early too if you're mana screwed and you really need to use your blood to find a land. It's just a really nice thing to have around. And again, there's lots of synergy around it. This is mostly an aggressive deck. You know, black-red, it can have a pretty aggressive curve. And most of the ways that black-red has to utilize these blood tokens are aggressive. You know, they're not more grindy type things. They're things that suddenly make your 3/3 menace into a 5/5 menace or make a creature unable to block and things like that. The key common here, I think, is Voldaren Epicure. This card has ended up being an overperformer in general. It does make blood after all. A 1-mana 1/1 that pings the opponent and gives you a blood on turn 1 is a great thing to start the game with if you're in this deck. If you're not in this deck, it's still a reasonable card, but this is the deck that can make use of the blood most effectively. And having blood available on turn 1 means that when you play your blood payoffs on later turns, you're going to be able to quickly cash in the blood you already made. And it's also ideal for helping you avoid mana screw, because even if you only have 1 land and things are going really bad, if your hand has like 1 or 2 Voldaren Epicures in it and 1 land, you can kind of keep it, because you can throw away things to try to find your land using the blood that it produces. So that's the key common. Overall, I think this is the best deck in the format. It comes together consistently. It's aggressive. Most of the best decks in this format are. This is a format that's relatively fast, and most of the decks that are in the top part of this list are aggressive. We'll see that there's at least one exception to that, but keep that in mind. I mostly think this format's pretty fast. The second best archetype, the second one in Tier 1, is red-green. This is really the only like purely tribal color pair in the format. All of the allied color pairs sort of have a tribal sub-theme, like red-black has vampires, but you'll notice I didn't really mention it, and that's because there aren't really that many vampire payoffs around. Not a lot of them, at lower rarities especially. It's a thing, but it's mostly a sub-theme. In red-green, it's not a sub-theme, it's all about wolves and werewolves. And this is another aggressive deck. It can have a really nice curve. There are lots of reasonably and efficiently costed wolves and werewolves. There's payoffs for having wolves and werewolves, both at common and uncommon. Obviously, the werewolves can get really scary in the later part of the game. And I think Hungry Ridge Wolf does a good job of sort of embodying what this deck is about, in that it is a 2-mana 2/2 that can become a 3/2 with trample if you have another wolf or werewolf in play. And if you're jamming enough wolves and werewolves into your deck, this is going to be a 3/2 pretty often. You do have to, there's a little bit of a build around element maybe to red-green because so many cards care about wolves and werewolves, but there's a lot of them in the color pair. But yeah, this deck is really aggressive, has nice payoffs like Hungry Ridge Wolf just for getting wolves going, and I've been pretty happy with it overall. The last of these top tier archetypes for me is blue-white. This time around, again, spirits aren't really the main theme. This time around, it's sort of enchantments / disturb. Everything with disturb in this set comes back as an enchantment, so these things are interrelated. This deck is a little less aggressive than the first two, but it can still have pretty aggressive curves, as a lot of these blue and white creatures with disturb that turn into auras are just reasonably costed cards. Lantern Bearer for me is the key common for this deck. It's another card that's good in a whole lot of decks, but this deck is sort of a skies deck. Blue-white has access to a bunch of flyers. Lantern Bearer is one of them, and it can make something else into a flyer. This deck can really just sort of curve out, trade creatures off, and then bring them back as auras in the mid to late game, and that tends to be pretty powerful pretty often. You're getting a lot more value out of your cards than your opponent is, thanks to all of this disturb. So that's the top tier. Those are the 3 decks that I think come together the most consistently, especially obviously if they're open. And again, that's what you should be doing, is just drafting whatever's open. A tier list like this is really just useful for sort of keeping in mind your pick order a little bit in the early going of a draft, because, if you think 1 archetype or 3 archetypes are way better than the rest, and you're like, well, should I take this, card that's mostly for the blue-black deck, or should I take one that's for the black-red deck? And I would say the black-red deck if you have, all things being equal, because that deck's better. Basically, you should always just be drafting what's open, because like I said earlier, these color pairs are all perfectly viable in this format, even if some are better or worse than others. Anyway, that's tier 1. Again, easy to come together, especially if they're open. Even if they're not, there's so many good cards at common and uncommon in these color pairs. 2 drafters can usually be in on these decks and still end up with pretty good decks. Tier 2, obviously a little bit worse. These are decks that aren't quite as effective at coming together with basically just commons and uncommons. And at the top of tier 2, I have black-white. So I said earlier that, a lot of the first few decks we're looking at are more aggressive ones. That's not really the case with black-white. It can be a little bit aggressive, but it's a life gain deck. It's a deck that its payoffs aren't just about helping you attack more effectively, which is effectively what we have going on with red-black, red-green, and blue-white. The payoffs also, or more so really, are about grinding out slow value because you're gaining life. Gaining life helps keep you alive. That means you can then use the life you gain. Things trigger when you gain life and you get value out of them. And this deck is really good at countering the other 3 we just talked about. There are a lot of nice defensive creatures that gain you life. There's lots of value to be gotten. And if those first 3 decks we looked at, if they don't have you pretty low on life quickly, they're going to have a hard time. And the black-white deck is really good at making sure that doesn't happen. I was looking at a lot of different cards that I thought could sort of be the key common. And in the end, I went with Gluttonous Guest. This is an interesting card because it really overlaps into a bunch of different decks. It makes blood, and you'll play it in the red-black deck pretty happily, but because of its stat line, it isn't, ideal necessarily in that deck, because that deck is mostly aggressive. It's better here because it's a really effective blocker for all those early creatures like Hungry Ridge Wolf and stuff. The blood it gives you is great. You can take advantage of it, and you can gain life throughout the game. You're going to end up with enough blood that you'll end up gaining a significant amount of life with Gluttonous Guest too. And yeah, it's just been really key at making sure this deck can get to the later part of the game when it can sort of take over. Lots of good payoffs for gaining life, lots of repeatable ways to gain life like Gluttonous Guest. It's a pretty good deck. Next up, I have red-white. All the decks we've talked about so far are reasonably synergistic. That's not really true with red-white. It's just an aggro deck. And that's what sort of has it a notch below these more synergistic aggro decks we looked at in Tier 1. It doesn't have as much synergy, but it does have a pretty impressive curve out. It has access to lots and lots of good 1-drops, 2-drops, and 3-drops. And that's pretty much what the game is all about with it. It has lots of creatures with haste. It has lots of ways to do a bunch of damage out of nowhere. It's a good deck, but it doesn't really have any sort of mechanical synergy outside of being aggressive. And the key comment I went with here is Traveling Minister. Like Gluttonous Guest, this is another one that sort of overlaps into a bunch of different decks. It's good in the black-white deck we already looked at because it's a repeatable way to gain life, but I decided to put it here because it's better at making you have attacks in the red-white deck, especially because there are like common first strikers around, you have evasive creatures, you just often have some very real stuff to do by pumping some of your other creatures. So I think Traveling Minister for me is a key common here. That isn't to say, some of these other key commons, it's like, well, yeah, it's not really good in other decks. The Minister is good in basically every white deck. It's been one of the biggest overperformers in the set. I talked about it a few weeks ago when I talked about overperformers in the set, and I think it's even better now. So it's a great card, but I do think it's really a key common for red-white, more than the others, even if it's good everywhere. But yeah, red-white and aggro deck, a good one, but not really one that has any special mechanical synergy to put it over the top. Next up, it's green-white. This is another one where there's like a human theme, but it's more of a sub-theme, and the primary theme is all about plus and plus one counters, and to a lesser extent, the training mechanic. So I mentioned that blood has been a big overperformer. Well, training has been kind of an underperformer overall in this set. A lot of the creatures, especially the 2-mana 1/2 with training, the way they're costed and how they work ends up being pretty awkward. You play your 2-mana 1/2 on turn 2, and then on turn 3, maybe you play something that it can attack with that makes it bigger, but then you have to wait to attack with that thing until turn 4. So you can see that by the time you're attacking on turn 4 and it becomes a 2/3, it's not usually going to be that impressive. And so that's kind of a problem that training has. I'm not saying you can't play cards with training or that even that 1/2 is a bad card. It's just been worse than people expected, including me. And luckily, though, this color pair is not all about training. It's also just about plus and plus one counters, and there are other ways to put them on things. And I really like the evasive creatures with training because it's a lot easier for them to get in and get buffed. And that's why I have as the key common for green-white as Griff Rider, 3-mana 2/1 flyer with training. It gets trained a lot easier because it doesn't have the problem of getting blocked by like a 3/3. It becomes a 3/2 relatively easily. Oftentimes it becomes a 4/3. Overall, the Griff Rider has been a very nice common for this deck. And yeah, this deck's about plus and plus one counters and training, and to a lesser extent, humans. Overall, a pretty solid deck. So we've basically covered all of the more aggressive decks so far, and you can see that they all sort of appeared in the top half of this tier list of mine. Now, basically, the 4 remaining decks we're going to look at, the 4 remaining color pairs, are all grindier, slower ones. Again, that doesn't mean they're bad in this format and you should only draft aggro. It's just that these aggro decks seem to come together a lot more consistently than the remaining 4 we're going to look at. We're still in tier 2 here, and we're moving into now blue-red. It's about non-creature spells, so it's about casting things that aren't creatures and getting value out of them. It takes a while to grind out value with this deck. I have the key common as Cruel Witness. This is a really nice card. I mean, it just has good flying stats that if your opponent can't deal with it, actually represents a pretty real clock. And the fact it lets you surveil anytime you cast a non-creature spell means it's especially good here. You're going to be stocked up with non-creature spells. You're going to get a lot of value out of them. But yeah, this deck, if you don't do a good job of making sure you have some early action on the board, you can get run over by some of these more aggressive decks. Blue-black is the last of these tier 2 decks, and this is the exploit slash zombies to a lesser extent deck. And, going into the format, I felt like blue-black was going to be really good. It seemed like there was enough sacrifice fodder for exploit and things like that. But because the speed of the format is what it is, exploit is a lot harder to get behind in situations where you don't have good sacrifice fodder. And even though you frequently will have good things to sacrifice, having a card that sort of subtracts from your board in a meaningful way when it exploits something often isn't worth it. It makes the mechanic a lot worse when even the fail case isn't very good, and that's basically what you have here. Now, if you do have good things, if you manage to pick up the sacrifice fodder to really take advantage of exploit, this ends up being a pretty nice deck. And that's why I have as the key common here, Doomed Dissenter, because this is a great common. If you play this on turn 2 and then later in the game, you play a card with exploit, like the one that bounces a creature to your opponent's library, and you sacrifice this and get a 2/2 out of it, it feels great. And there are other things too at common and uncommon that you can sacrifice. And when this deck comes together, it can be quite strong, really rivaling a deck like Black-White at the top of Tier 2, but it doesn't come together as consistently as I'd like. And it's just kind of a slower mechanic in a format, Exploit is, in a format where you can really get punished for being too slow. Now let's move into Tier 3. These are two decks. Again, they're both perfectly viable, but the thing that they don't have that basically all the other decks have, with maybe the exception of Red-White, is they don't have a whole lot of synergy that comes together easily, and that is a problem in a format where basically all the other color pairs do have synergy, and it doesn't take that much to get it going. Whereas these two decks, black-green and blue-green, require you to get some pretty specific cards that you aren't that likely to get. Black-green is the deck all about high toughness. And the problem here is there's only one common card in the set that's a high toughness payoff. All the rest are uncommon or higher, and that means you're really reliant on getting uncommons to make this deck into this high toughness deck. And it can happen. In a draft video that went up earlier this week, I had a deck that went 6-3 that actually got there in all of this synergy, but I mostly got lucky in my draft and picked up uncommons like the Catapult Captain and things like that that really made the deck come together. Most of the time, the black-green deck just ends up being kind of a mid-rangey good stuff deck, and that's not a bad place to be. Black and green has some very good commons and uncommons, and even though you don't have the synergy, you can certainly beat decks that do. It's just going to be a little less consistent than the other decks because the synergistic mechanical aspect of this color pair is so hard to make work. In the end, for the key common, I have Flourishing Hunter. This I have here because this deck tends to be this sort of mid-rangey good stuff deck, and when it is, this is still a really nice card. I mean, it's 6 mana for a 6/6 that gains you like 4 life usually, and that's a pretty darn good deal. Really helps you stabilize, and that's something you really need in a format where there are very real aggro threats. And, I think some people are probably like, well, isn't the key uncommon the 113, the zombie phalanx? And I would say, not really. Yes, you play that card when you actually pick up all of those high toughness payoffs, but that's like, what, 15 to 20% maybe of the black-green decks you draft? That's not the majority of them, and when you can't combo it with some of the other things like Flourishing Hunter or the Catapult Captain or these things, when you can't combo that 113 with those, it's not a very good card at all. You have to have the combos or it's not worth it, and that's why I don't have it as a key common, because the typical form this deck takes doesn't even want to play that card, but sometimes you do play the 113 if you end up in a synergistic enough deck, but that's a rarity, and that's what makes this the 9th best deck in the format for me. And the last deck, the one that's at the bottom here, and it pains me to say it, is blue-green self-mill. I had a lot of fun with this archetype in the last set, but there's a few things in this set that keep it from being nearly as good. One of them is that this set only has one graveyard mechanic. Part of what made blue-green self-mill so good in the last set is the fact that you had access to Disturb and Flashback. So your chances of milling things that gave you value out of your graveyard were just way, way higher. Here, that's not really the case. And the other problem is there aren't that many good ways to mill yourself. You don't have access to a card that just like mills the top 4 cards of your library for an efficient cost. You don't have access to really any cards that efficiently mill your library. Even the Signpost Uncommon, which does do it efficiently, does it incredibly slowly. So you just don't end up either with enough ways to mill yourself or enough payoffs for milling yourself for this deck to really be that synergistic most of the time. The majority of the time, it's just a blue-green good stuff deck, which again, can be pretty good if you pick up high-quality commons and uncommons. Like any deck, you can be successful, but the lack of this extra synergistic angle that most of the other decks have does make it weaker than the other ones. The key common I have here is Skywarp Scob. I like this card a fair bit, and this deck does mill itself better than others. It just still doesn't do a great job of it, and if you can play the Scob and draw a card with it, it does a pretty amazing job of pulling you back ahead, sort of like Flourishing Hunter. It's a big creature that stabilizes things. It's hard for a lot of the creatures in the format to attack through it, and the card it draws you have time to use thanks to the 2/5 body. So that's what I have as the key common for blue-green, but again, it's just not that synergistic of a deck. That's true of black-green as well, and that's really what holds those two into Tier 3. But again, The good news is there's not a crazy amount of imbalance between color pairs or imbalance between archetypes in this set to such a degree that you should just be avoiding some of these. If one of these is open and you draft it, you're going to end up with a pretty good deck. All right, let's move now to our Crack-A-Pack. That's how we usually close out one of these episodes of Nizzanotes. I'm going to look at a pack one, pick one situation, talk about all the cards in the pack, and then tell you what I would first pick out of it. All right, so our first common is Desperate Farmer. This is another one of these cards that nicely sort of is in multiple decks. It works in multiple decks. It's not bad in blue-black because, while it's not something you want to sacrifice in blue-black, if you do sacrifice a thing, it'll transform into a 4/3 with lifelink. And it's also nice in black-white because it gains you life. That said, it's not much more than a decent card. You'll play it in both of those decks a reasonable chunk of the time, but it's nothing special. Evolving Wilds is next. I like fixing a lot in this set. I talked about that last week. This format has a lot of bombs, and the more bombs there are, the better fixing gets to be because the chances you can play the bombs you open are higher if you have an Evolving Wilds lying around. That said, you don't want to take it this early. I would definitely take it over Desperate Farmer, but I'm sure there'll be like 5 cards in this pack, if not more, that I would take over the Wilds. Taking it around mid-pack is pretty reasonable, though. Cruel Witness, we just saw this. I think it's a really nice common, one of Blue's better commons, and especially good in the blue-red deck. Yeah, it'd be what I would pick right now out of this pack. I would take it over Evolving Wilds. We've got Nebelgast Beguiler next. This card's not very good. Most of the time, you probably shouldn't play it. I think people overrate it because they know Master Decoy type effects are good and limited, but this one is just so weird. First of all, it costs 5 to cast in the first place. Most of the time when this effect is good, the card costs a lot less. You can get it down early. And the other weird thing about it is you're like paying this 5 mana to get a 2/5 body, which isn't a terrible rate, but you basically never take advantage of that 2/5 body because you just use it to tap things. So you have like 2 defensive cards here, and you only get to use half of it, basically. And yeah, it's just not very good. I haven't been impressed with it. It's too slow. If it came down earlier, it would be a big difference, but it doesn't. Cradle of Safety. I don't love this, but it's okay, especially in the blue-white enchantment deck. You can use it to save stuff, and that's when you really get a blowout. There are situations where you just can't use it, though, or you can't leave the mana up, and that's frustrating. But it is something I would play. I would still take Cruel Witness, though. Mind Leech Ghoul next. This is probably the least impressive of all the exploit creatures, but it has a baseline as a 2-mana 2/2, so it's sort of acceptable. Occasionally going after a card in your opponent's hand is nice, especially if you have something worthwhile to sacrifice to it, but I wouldn't take it over Cruel Witness or Evolving Wilds for that matter. Next up, we're on Moldgraph Millipede. This is a card that could have been sort of the key common for the blue-green deck, but it just costs so much mana, 5, and it's so inconsistent just because there aren't other good ways to mill yourself, not enough of them at lower rarities, that it often isn't big enough to be worth it. It's not a very good card overall in the format. Blood Servitor, same thing. This is another not very good card. You'll play it if you have all the blood payoffs ever, and you just need to jam as much blood into your deck as you can, which happens sometimes. But, as I said, those blood decks tend to be pretty aggressive, and this is not a good creature for an aggressive deck, so it's very awkward. Mostly, you just don't play it. So, right now, it would go Cruel Witness, Evolving Wilds. Those are the top 2 cards in the pack. We've got Flame Blessed Bolt next, though, which I think is our new first pick. It is very efficient at killing a whole lot of things in the format. It kills any X2, and then it exiles it. And that exile clause really matters in this format. First, it deals with disturbed creatures entirely. Second, it turns off death triggers. So you can use it on like a Doom Dissenter or something like that and not have to worry about the 2/2 zombie. And there's a lot of other cards in this format where Flame Blessed Bolt doing its thing, its exile thing, really matter. Those are just a couple of quick examples. You usually pay 1 mana to kill a 2 or 3 or 4 mana card, and that feels great. I would definitely take Flame Blessed Bolt right now out of this pack, followed by Cruel Witness, followed by Evolving Wilds. Next up, we've got Wolf Strike, another premium removal spell. I don't think it's quite as good as Flame Blessed Bolt. It can take down bigger things for sure, but it has the major risk that green removal often has, and that is that you have to pick the right window to use it, or it just doesn't do anything. Like, if you don't have a creature in play big enough, this doesn't do anything. Even if you do have a creature big enough and you aren't careful about when you use it, your opponent can blow up your creature and get a 2-for-1. The good news is it's an instant, so you can find windows to use it much more effectively, and green decks have lots of creatures, but I do think Flame Blessed Bolt is better overall, but Wolf Strike does move up to being the number 2 card in this pack for me, followed by Cruel Witness, and then the Wilds. So we move into uncommons now. Our first one is Lunar Rejection. It's a nice card. I mean, 4 mana to bounce a thing and draw a card is a reasonable deal. You know, you get rid of something on board and it replaces itself, so you're getting a 1-for-1 trade, which is pretty nice and some tempo. Usually the fact it's way cheaper sometimes to bounce a wolf or werewolf is great, but it's not anywhere near as good as Wolf Strike or Flame Blast Bolt. And I think I would even take Cruel Witness over Lunar Rejection, probably not Evolving Wilds though. Pack Song Pup is our next uncommon. This is another really nice uncommon. This is one of those wolf or werewolf payoffs that just can snowball and become incredibly problematic for your opponent. It gets bigger really easily. You know, you have enough wolves and werewolves in this set. You can even play one on turn 1 in this format. And if you play the pup on turn 2, things just get out of hand in a hurry. And then even if your opponent can kill it, you get to gain the life back. So that's pretty awesome. Overall, I like the pup a lot. It's an interesting pick, but I think I would still take the Bolt or Wolf Strike over it. The pup has like a higher ceiling than either of them, but it really only works in one deck, the red-green deck. It doesn't work well in any other decks. And so it has this high ceiling, but I think the fact that it's somewhat limited in what it can be played in means that Wolf Strike and Flame Blast Bolt, I think, are better. I would take the pup over Cruel Witness, though, even though Cruel Witness is not quite as build-aroundy. Pack Song Pup's ceiling is high enough that I would take it over the Witness. Our last uncommon's a less exciting one, Innocent Traveler. It's a 4-mana 1/3, and at the beginning of your upkeep, any opponent can sacrifice a creature, but if nobody does, it transforms, and it becomes a 3/3 flyer that becomes a 5/3 flyer if your opponent doesn't control a human. Overall, I haven't loved this card. It's a decent playable, but anytime you have one of these cards where your opponent gets to make decisions like this, there's often a decision they can make that just doesn't affect them very much. Either they've gone wide enough that they don't care about giving up creatures, or they aren't afraid of a flying creature, and they'll just choose the option that doesn't really bother them. Sometimes this becomes more of a pick your poison type thing where your opponent is kind of in trouble no matter what, but those scenarios don't play out as often as you'd think. It's a fine card for sure, but I would definitely take Pack Song Pup, Wolf Strike, Flame Blast Bolt, Lunar Rejection, and Cruel Witness, I think, over it. I think it's a little better than Evolving Wilds, but not a lot. So that's what we're looking at now, but we have a really good rare, as one often does in this format. We've got Welcoming Vampire. This requires a little bit of work to make work, but not that much. I mean, if you're in white, you're going to end up with lots of creatures with 2 power or less, and you're just going to be drawing a card most turns with Welcoming Vampire. Even if you only draw 1 card with Welcoming Vampire, you're really going to feel like you're in business, and it turns into a value engine if it's left in play much longer. It's just not that hard to draw a bunch of cards with it. Every time I've seen this card played and stick, it won the game for whoever played it, because they were able to grind out so much value with Welcoming Vampire, on top of the fact that it just has efficient stats. So I would take Welcoming Vampire here in the end. We take the rare, again, as one often does in the format. It's not quite as bomby as some of the other ones. It's more of a value engine type card that takes some time to do its thing instead of just like slamming it on the table and you win the game the next turn. But it does its thing really effectively and has an amazing stats to go with it. So yeah, in the end I would go Welcoming Vampire would be what I would want first, followed by Flame Blast Bolt, then Wolf Strike, then Pack Song Pup, and so on. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. So that's what I would first pick there. Welcoming Vampire, a great card, a powerful card, and one we're happy to take with a first pick. This is an interesting pack because it has a bunch of cards in it I'd be happy to first pick, namely the Bolt, Wolf Strike, Pack Song Pup, and Welcoming Vampire, and to a lesser extent maybe Cruel Witness, but it also has some really bad cards in it, like Nebelgast, Beguiler, Moldgraph, Millipede, and Blood Servitor. So it's kind of a feast or famine type pack, where once you're in the second half of this pack, it's not going to look very good. So that does it for this edition of Nizzanotes. If you enjoyed this video, do me a favor and like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future videos, don't forget to subscribe. More than half of my viewers aren't subscribed, so if that's you, do me a favor and subscribe. You can also turn on notifications, and that'll keep you aware of future videos. If you want to catch up on past videos, including my set review and draft videos of this format, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting this channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.